Your discourse on inequality really has hit a nerve, and your book Capital seems to be a lot more popular than one could have expected. Did that surprise you?
Well, you know, I certainly tried to write a book that will be readable by a broad international audience, but of course I could not expect that it will be so successful. Now we are over 2 million copies worldwide. What this shows is that there is tremendous interest in inequality these days all over the world. There's a big concern about whether globalization is benefiting to everyone or is being captured by a small group of the population. And what's new in my book is that we have put together with many researchers from over 30 countries the largest historical database on income and wealth inequality that has ever been put together. So that's really what's new, is that I try to study inequality from an historical perspective.
Just a few months ago, I saw that the Pope Francis tweeted, "Inequality is the root of social evil." Would you go as far as the Pope? Is the Pope more radical than you on these issues?
Well, you know, I'm not, you know, I don't feel very, very close to what the Pope says in general, but you know, if he's concerned with inequalities, then you know, that's fine. You know, I'm not sure how much the Catholic Church has contributed to reduction of inequality historically, but I think inequality is a concern not only for people on the left, people on the right, people from different religious persuasion. It's a general concern for mankind, is that, you know, we cannot care only about the growth of total GDP. We want to know, you know, how this is distributed, who's benefiting from it, and at what cost for the natural resources, overall.
Well, this brings me to an interesting point, because I'd like you to comment on the story now that's been making headlines. Air France, bare-chested executives who were attacked by angry protesters from the group themselves, angered at cut.
Oh, look, I'm not here to give good and bad points to the different groups of actors. You know, let me simply say that conflict over distributions are often very violent, and you know, in some countries, particularly in poorer countries, they can take much more violent forms than in rich countries like France. And I think the lack of transparency about wages, income, ownership, who owns what, who receives what, very often tends to exacerbate this conflict. So I think, you know, generally speaking, having more information about the distribution of income and wealth is very important for our democratic debate. And one of the big limitations today, in particular, if we think of cross-border patterns of ownership, is that there's a lot of opacity, there's a lot of financial opacity.
Oh, well, we'll come to that, yeah.
So very often we don't know very well who owns what, which makes it very difficult to have a reasonable conversation about inequality and taxation.
Well, coming to taxation then, because you've argued for a progressive tax, and for the really high earners, correct me if I'm wrong, but those who earn €1 million or more a year, and 80% tax on their income. Now, we've asked our social media audience to ask us questions for this interview, and someone called Thomas Jones asks, why do you want to punish people who take risks to create wealth and jobs by higher taxes?
It's very difficult, because people, when it comes to inequality and taxation, people get very excited all the time. But let me throw one piece of evidence into the debate. If you take a country like the US, between 1930 and 1980, so a very long period of time, half a century, on average, the top marginal income tax rate applying above $1 million in annual income was 82%. Sometimes it was 91, sometimes it was 70. If you take the average over the entire 1930, 1980, it was 82%. Now, did this destroy American capitalism? Apparently, no. If anything, productivity growth and GDP growth was actually higher during the 50s, 60s, 70s than it has been since the Reagan years. So since the Reagan years, we have a big reduction in top marginal tax rate, a big increase in inequality. You see inequality everywhere, except in the productivity statistics. Many people are not ready for this discussion, I think partly because of historical amnesia. You know, sometimes people don't know that this has actually already been experimented in the past, and that if we look at this period where this was experimented, this was not so terrible in terms of productivity.
Then you must have been quite disappointed that French President François Hollande has seemingly backtracked on his kind of manifesto where he was going to, he proposed taxing the rich at 75%.
Actually, in France, I was not too much in favor of this decision because first, you don't have many people in France who make more than $1 million. So in the US, Hollande would have been an excellent president of the US. I think this would be exactly the policy to do in the US. In France, you don't have such a big problem of exploding top managerial compensation. So it was more, this policy was more an excuse for not doing a more ambitious tax reform. There are many other issues about more general tax reform in France that should be addressed.
Since we're focusing on Europe, let's have a quick look at this situation in terms of austerity, because I know that you are aligning yourself with anti-austerity parties. But can you say, hand on your heart, that austerity has been a complete failure?
Well, you can always do worse, of course, but let's compare the situation on both sides of the Atlantic. The truth of the matter is that Europe has transformed a crisis which initially came from the US, from the private financial sector of the US. Europe has transformed this into a public debt crisis in Europe just because of its bad policy and excessive austerity. Because initially, if we go back to 2008, public debt in Europe was not higher than in the US, was not higher than in Japan. And if we look at the situation, now in 2015, so it's almost 10 years after 2007, GDP in the US is now back on track, 10-15% higher than what it was in 2007, whereas in Europe, and particularly in the Eurozone, we are still not recovered. We are still at the same level of GDP as we were almost 10 years ago.
So there are new parties in Europe that are presenting new ideas. You're aligning yourself with those, and I'm thinking of Podemos, that's led by Pablo Iglesias, and the new Labour leadership in Britain under Jeremy Corbyn. Do they present for you then the best chance Europe has, or Europeans have, for a fairer future? And can their economic policies actually be viable?
I think the elections in Spain in December of this year can be very important, yes, for the future of Europe. Why is it very important? Because I think this can change the political majority in the Eurozone. If Spain turns to the left or to the center-left, this is changing the political majority. And potentially, I think this can get us to more reasonable budgetary policies in Europe. And I think, this goes, in the end, this goes beyond the issue of left or right. I think everybody observing the Eurozone from the outside, whether you're from the left, from the right, can see that the budgetary decisions that have been taken under the direction of Germany and France, because it's too easy for France just to complain about Germany, it was a joint decision, have not been successful.
But it's interesting that politically, though, that we see that these parties on the far left, they're called radical left parties, I don't know if you agree with that terminology, but they seem to inspire more fear in terms of the EU institutions and European leaders than the leaders of the far right.
Well, that would be a big mistake. In the end, it's much better to have this party on the left of the left in power than, parties which are on the right of the right. And, in my country, in France, there will be regional elections also in December, and possibly the extreme right can win 1 or 2 or 3 regions, and then people will realize that this is far more dangerous than Syriza and Podemos, who at least have an internationalist approach. I'm not saying that what they propose is always completely convincing or satisfactory, but I think it's possible to draw them in the right direction.
Well, you talked about Greece and Syriza, and obviously Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has been re-elected. Do you think he has a chance of renegotiating austerity measures? Because his former Finance Minister, Yanis Varoufakis, has said it's just continuing an extend and pretend logic.
Well, Europe will have to come with a new plan with Greece. I think what was decided this summer is just a way to gain a little bit of time, but in the end, we will have to come to a debt reduction for Greece. The good news is that we've had lots of debt restructuring in the past, including Germany, who had a huge public debt and foreign debt after World War II. The entire European project in the 1950s was actually built on debt forgiveness. And the general philosophy was, okay...
It's a very different context, though.
Well, this is in some ways comparable, is that many governments have made a lot of mistakes in the past and built big public debt, and very big mistakes were made by many governments before the 1950s, particularly in Germany. But the political choice was made in the 1950s to say, okay, look at the future. If we think to the young generation of Germans or French in the 50s or the young generation of Greeks today, when are you going to tell them? Okay, your parents have made mistakes, so for the next 40 years you will have to pay. But at some point you have to look at the future, invest in growth, invest in higher education, invest in public infrastructure.
Let me interrupt you because I need to bring in some questions from our social media audience. Hazel Michelle Chandra asks, what's the key to a sustainable economy?
Most important thing for the future is to invest in knowledge and to invest in higher education. So just one number illustrating what we don't do and what we should do. Everybody, in Europe likes Erasmus, which allows students to go to other countries. Except that Erasmus budget, right now is only 4 billion euro per year. Just to compare, total interest payment in the Eurozone each year, 400 billion euro. So I'm not saying we should exactly invert this number, but I think we should go in this direction. And this is why, we need to have a moratorium on debt repayment in order to invest more in the future.
We've been talking about Greece, but then there's also the situation in Britain, two countries which could still leave the EU and the Eurozone for Greece. There's also the possibility of Catalonia splitting away from Spain. What impact would that have on a European economy and for the homegrown economies themselves?
Well, I think this shows that the situation, the crisis in the Eurozone really has far-reaching consequences. So people in Spain today are very unhappy, in particular in Catalonia.
You put it down to the economic crisis, these countries potentially leaving the EU and Eurozone.
Yes. Look, in Britain, I understand that people don't want to join the Eurozone or to join further European integration because right now it's really not working. So we have to, if we want one day Britain or Sweden or Poland to join the Eurozone, we have to make it work.
Exactly. We're seeing a Europe that is more polarized than ever. If we continue on the same trajectory, how do you see Europe? What's your vision of Europe, say, in 15 years' time?
I want to be optimistic because I think there are solutions to our problem, but there is a risk of rising nationalism and selfishness. And when people don't manage to solve their social and unemployment and domestic problems through peaceful policy, then it's always tempting to blame others. And so, you have political parties who want to blame foreigners, who want to blame foreign workers, or you can blame other countries, you can blame Germany, and Germany will blame Greece. And, you can always blame someone else. But at some point, if we take a broader European historical perspective, we will realize that what we should do today is invest in growth. And the drama of Europe over the past 10 years is that we've had a lost decade. We are going to end up in 2017 with a GDP level which is barely the level of 2007.
Another issue that Europe is dragging its heels on is migration. Greece is on the front line of that. We hear that nearly 1.5 million people could arrive to Europe by the end of 2016. And we've got a question from Christopher Nyborg who says, would you say that Europe is economically capable of handling that flow of refugees and migrants?
Okay, so the population of Europe, is 520 million. Now, between 2000 and 2010, if you look at the UN statistics, the net flow of migrants into Europe was about 1 million per year. 1 million per year. And two-thirds of the demographic growth of Europe during this period came from net migration. So I think we could perfectly return to much higher migration flow. I think you have different situations in Europe. You have countries like France who have a bit more children. In Germany, they have less children. They are more open to migrants. And then you have some countries, they don't want children and they don't want migrants either, in Eastern Europe. And so, they're going to disappear in terms of population if they continue like this. And this is very selfish. Mm-hmm. And I think, for economic growth and more generally for the prosperity and the attractiveness of the European model, we could and should be a lot more open.
The figure that Europe could manage in terms of economic migrants and refugees, you would put it at 1 million?
I'm not saying that 1 million is the magic number, but certainly people who are saying that we cannot welcome more migrants do not look at the historical record.
I'd like to change tack now, and your protege, or so he's called, Gabriel Zucman, has said that some $6 trillion of assets could be hidden in tax havens. Is that an accurate figure in your opinion?
Oh yes, and this is very important for us in Europe and the US. This will be even more important for Africa and emerging and developing countries. We are losing much more than us from financial opacity. The estimates of Gabriel Zucman is that in Europe, maybe you have 10% of all financial wealth that is held in tax havens. That's a lot. But in Africa, it's between 30 and 50%.
Whoa. Yeah.
So, how do you want a country to develop and to develop an equitable tax system if you have a big part of the wealth that's going away, and that's not paying tax?
If we bring it back to Europe, the European Commission president says he wants to stamp out tax havens. Do you believe him?
Well, no, I don't believe it, because at this stage there is no concrete decision. If we want to change, what has happened with corporate taxation in Europe, we need to have a single corporate tax. Maybe not for the whole of Europe, if some countries don't want it, but at least the countries that want to move ahead, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Belgium, whatever group of countries within the Eurozone or maybe other countries want to do it, should move ahead, have a common corporate tax. Otherwise, the kind of scandal that we had with Luxembourg leaks last year will happen again. So,
do you think do you think Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission president, has adequately defended himself on that?
Well, it's not enough to apologize. It's not enough to apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry, I will not do it again. Because, in fact, this will happen again. This is not a problem of individuals like Jean-Claude Juncker. But, the fact that when he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg, he had all these deals with large multinational corporations where they would pay 1 or 2% in tax, as opposed to our small and medium-sized companies in France or in Germany who are paying 20-30% in tax. How do you want to give lessons to Greece about modernization of the tax system when this is the policy that you conducted in your own country?
Well, we began on your book, Capital in the 21st Century. Let's go back to it, because you draw on a lot of literary sources for that book, and it's probably what makes it a bit more readable. And I'd like to bring in this question from our social media. It's somebody who goes by the name of Mecus, who asks, what are your 3 favourite books?
Oh, that's complicated. So in my book, I talk a lot about Balzac, Le Père Goriot, and indeed, I think this was such a powerful way to talk about capitalism in the 19th century. And Marx in the 1860s was saying that this is by reading Balzac that he had learned the most about capitalism. Now, I think this is the same today, but you have to switch authors. So if one of my favorite novels recently was the latest novel of Carlos Fuentes, La Voluntà y la Fortuna, which is an incredible novel about capitalism in Mexico. Tancred Voiturier, who is a young French author who recently wrote about the invention of poverty, which is a very funny novel about how development economists pretend to save the world and don't always save the world. So you have lots of very powerful novels that put money and capitalism at the center of their investigation.
And you're described often as a rock star economist now because of Capital. Do you recognize yourself in that?
I have no problem with the publicity as long as it gets more people to read my book. The success of my book shows is that there are many people in many countries who are tired to hear that this is too complicated for them, who are tired to hear that economic and financial issues should be left to a small group of experts who have built such a sophisticated economic science and the rest of the world cannot understand. This is a big joke. There is no economic science. These are political issues, social issues, cultural, literary issues, and everybody should have an opinion.
Thomas Piketty, many thanks for having been with us.
Thank you.